layers, and sort of the upper layers, and see things happening vertically, throughout the cityscape, and began to, even before it was done, per se, imagine a vertically stacked mixed-use project in New York being the sort of the apotheosis of that. Next. In Italian magazines, I love this one, I don't know why this is an Italian magazine, Illustrazione Italiana from 1913, Italian illustrations. This is the future circulation and skyscrapers of New York. New York seems to be the thing to focus on when we're talking about the future. And you can see the lower levels and the train tracks and subways. You can see the transit and the freight areas, the loading. Then you can see the upper retail mezzanines with the retail windows and canopies. Then you see the whatever office hotel. And then you see upper pedestrian areas. And again, event spaces up on the higher zones. So again, an illustration of what it would be like to actually have activity vertically, not just horizontally. Movies were doing it too. 1927, Metropolis, very famous and highly animated film by Fritz Lang, and the set designer was Eric Kellhut. And wonderful images, but again gave us the idea that there was a section in these tall buildings of different things happening over the height of the buildings. Some of the first buildings that actually became de facto mixed-use vertical towers were hotels, because they inevitably held amenities and different things throughout the hotel. And the moving of the help me with this. The Waldorf Astoria, thank you. When it moved from near Times Square over the park.
We just read it.
You can read it, I can't read it. And I forgot it. But it was sort of the World Hotel, the ultimate mixed-use building. And it's surprising to me for a couple of things. It's the first hotel in my mind that moves from a kind of a more historic model to a skyscraper model. Now, those of you, there are a number of designers in the room here. This is a slab, right? This is a slab that's actually a U, but it's articulated as if it's two towers from the tops to the way the flutes and all that. So clearly, the designers Schultz and Weaver were trying to get the idea of the tall building. That was an important icon for them to achieve in developing the hotel. And clearly, there's an enormous podium here. And you all know the hotel, probably know maybe less about the lower levels. The entry levels on the various perimeters, the high bay banqueting spaces. There are amenity spaces. There were at least designed cafes and outdoor spaces on the setbacks as you go up. So in a sense, the hotel was elaborating a mixed-use building more than other building types had done. Next. And I won't go into much on this, but Rockefeller Center between 1926, which began as a site study identification problem for the Metropolitan Opera Company, ended up being Rockefeller City, which became Rockefeller Center, which became RCA's headquarters, and in some ways now began to sort of bring us, Le Corbusier's, activated roofs, the idea of the vertical section, the idea of the lower elements here, and sort of the animated plane, the lower level, of course, all the trains and subway, and the lower level, and then the activation of roofs, even at the top of the main tower. This project really was the last of the pre-war buildings. You see the drawings here as well as the actual photograph. It sort of brought this together in America before the beginning of the war. Back in Europe, following the war, immediately following the war, Le Corbusier was commissioned to do five apartment buildings for about 1,500 residents each in 5 cities. The one we know the most, but there were 5, is the one in Marseille, the Unité d'Adaptation in Marseille. And basically he had relatively little control over the groundscape, and you'll remember his plan for the city for $3 million. And he basically took the city and put it up into a tall building. He actually, this drawing doesn't show it, but he had a common public and retail street through the midsection. It didn't do well, it was criticized, it became dangerous, it was abandoned, but he actually put that amenity street up through the building and developed the building as a city in a tower. Next. The rooftop, which is again one of his 5 points of his new modern architecture. The rooftop was a recreational open space area. The wall was a complicated, he was proposing window walls. I don't know if this really qualifies as a window wall, but it's a complex skin with brise-soleils and patios and double height spaces against the window wall. So it was quite a complex residence in the tower. It really takes the many studios, single-story, two-story buildings he had done, and had not had a chance for several decades to do an actual tall building. This was his opportunity to do that. So you can kind of see the studio, many studio buildings he did sort of assembled into a tall building. Next. And then we had, of course, Frank Lloyd Wright's, in the 50s, his mile-high building, in which he told us, although we wouldn't have many indications about it, that all the needs of the city were placed in this building. So I guess the shoe shine is here, the city hall is here, something that's a little hard to know. But again, this iconic, sort of perfect object, if you will. And Frank Lloyd Wright's persistent distrust of the city, I would say, if that's not too strong a word. Sitting in broad acres, single-family homes, an organic relationship between the landscape and farming and the democratic house. So everything went in a tall building, and this was restated in the late 80s, actually, in Tokyo Bay by the Millennium Tower by Norman Foster, a building that would be 2 times the height of the Sears Tower, which, as ridiculous as that sounds, is about what we think the Burj Dubai will be when it opens later this year. So interesting to compare those two. Next. And in the 60s and beyond, Archie Graham and sort of this obsession with the tall building, the city, and technology, and how technology becomes the signifier kind of progress, and then the implicit humor of it, I think, in the minds of Ron Herron and Peter Cook, from walking city to plug-in city to something that was actually really built. The early drawings by Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano for Place Pompidou. And what's interesting about it is you can see, not that much happened this way, but you can see the original ideas that it was that the screen or the surface would project image, text, content, and all that, something that, since this building, is happening in an enormous way right now. Next. And the 2000 pavilion in Hanover for the Expo 2000 by MVRDV, where everything is very explicit, highly articulated, independent, so you sort of see very polemically kind of what every level is, and that's the building that you get. Interesting example of tall building, a fairly free program. The environmental skyscraper, everyone is talking about the environment. So there's a chapter about where we sort of sit in terms of the tall building now in the environment and sort of energy awareness. Next. There is in the beginning some discussions, some considerable discussions about can a tall building actually be environmentally sensitive. There's a lot of discussions about net zero tall buildings and zero footprint and returning energy to the grid. These are all things that are being studied right now, and as far from being conclusive about it, the metrics for that and for measuring the amount of embodied energy that goes into building the building before it uses energy is still really uncharted, although it's being studied at a number of institutes and universities right now. But the chapter takes Norman Foster and Ken Yang and looks at them as 2 examples, 2 case studies for the tall building. And this is Willis Faber Dumas in Ipswich in the UK by Norman Foster, and although you say it's 3 stories, it is not very tall. There are things in here that are very much about high-performance glass. There's a huge atrium through the center of this building that brings light in there. There's open office space. There's natural ventilation. The top now is occupied. There's recreational space on the top floor. So you can see this building is 3 stories getting extruded through his career. Next. The ITN headquarters in London. Again, I don't know if that qualifies as a tall building, but Willis Faber is this. Now ITN is this. Again, the atrium through the middle. The amount of natural light, which is borrowed ambient light, the ability to ventilate and exhaust heat, the idea of floors which are open, and now because we're getting taller and taller, we're starting to have neighborhoods vertically, not just horizontally in the organization of the section. Next. And of course, when we get tall, Commerce Bank in the mid-90s in Frankfurt. Now he's added many floors to that, but the atrium is still there. The ability to get outside, the ability to vent and flue, the idea to be able to bring natural light into the space. Germany has, as does Switzerland, has very rigorous requirements as it relates to the amount of natural light and the distance from the window wall, as well as the percentage of fresh air that has to be brought into workspace. So this was his